the 1830s, seceded. They fought a minor war against Mexico. They captured Santa Anna's army, who was sent in to stop them. And Mexico didn't, Santa Anna himself signed a treaty with the Texan rebels granting them independence. The government of Mexico said, well, no, Santa Anna was just a general. He can surrender an army, but he had no authority to sign away Mexican territory. So the country of Mexico refused to acknowledge Texas was independent. And then 10 years later, when Texas was annexed by the U.S., there were increased tensions, and then shortly after that, Mexican-American War broke out. Okay, so this is an example when a country refused to acknowledge the independence and how bad things happened. So at least Britain, was willing to acknowledge reality. The second key point here, this area here where my pen is, would be the boundary of the 13 colonies. But as you can see, this green goes all the way to the Mississippi. Great Britain had, claim to all of that land, and they gave up that claim to the United States. Okay, so what happened was, now we immediately were a fairly large nation. In terms of Europe, we were larger than any other country except Russia. Okay, just in terms of Europe, this territory by itself. And it allowed it provided the foundation for growth and expansion of the United States. It wasn't like we were trying to cram in people into the 13 colonies. Now there was plenty of land, and we could absorb a huge population. Okay, so that was also a real big thing. The peace treaty granted us all that land to the Mississippi. Okay, all right. The Articles of Confederation. Let's go ahead and look at a handout. Basically, if you're looking for a characterization, it is a very weak system of government. And by the time we're done looking at this handout, we will see why, in fact, that was the case. In America, when we hear the word Confederacy, we immediately think of the Civil War and the slave states in the South, okay, because the slave states seceded in 1860 and 61 and formed the Confederate States of America, okay. The reason, but ultimately, the word Confederacy just means a weak connection, a weak alliance of states, okay? The idea of a confederacy is that each of these individual countries or regions are going to have a lot of power, and your central government is going to be fairly weak. So you might think, well, what's the point of having a confederacy? Well, the reason why the slave states in 1860 and 61 formed a confederacy was they didn't want Washington, D.C. telling them they had to free their slaves. And when they formed their confederacy, their Confederate government, they didn't want their own Confederate government to have power to tell them to free their slaves. So they formed a confederacy in which the capital in Richmond, Virginia, would have some power, but each of those slave states would have lots of power, and they would never have to worry about being told they had to free their slaves. So the reason why the people in the Confederacy wanted to form a confederacy as opposed to other types of government was because they wanted to make sure each of these slave states had political power, and that the capital or the central government couldn't boss them around. So the idea of a confederation is a weak government. That is by design. If different regions or districts are going to form a confederacy, the idea is they want to keep lots of power to themselves, and the new central government will be weak and won't be able to dictate to them. Okay, so You know, I'm going to be saying some negative things about the Confederacy. You might be thinking, well, gee, you know, didn't they realize this at the time? Yes, they did. And this is why. They deliberately designed, they wanted this government to be very weak, okay? So, you know, they were very deliberate about this. You might think, why create a government if you're gonna have a weak central government? Well, keep in mind, the whole problem with the struggle against Britain since 1763 was there was a government that was just dominating them and bossing them around and not giving them their freedom. So when the founding fathers created their new government, they said, well, we're not going to create a tyrannical government here on our own shores. We want to make sure the new government we create for ourselves is going to be weak and won't ever be able to act in a tyrannical manner towards ourselves. So again, they didn't want to recreate on American shores the tyrannical authority that they were fighting against in England, okay? Now, they did a really good job of that. The Articles of Confederation was such a weak government, there's no way anybody could have had a tyrannical authority over anybody else. George Washington in 1785 wrote a letter, and he says, contracted ideas, local pursuits, and absurd jealousy are continually leading us from those great and fundamental principles which are characteristic of wise and powerful nations, and without which we are no more than a rope of sand and shall as easily be broken. Okay? Even if you've never been to a beach before, well, actually here in the high desert we have plenty of sand. You can imagine somebody trying to weave together a rope out of sand. That's going to be tough, isn't it? Okay? You're just going to, it'll be an exercise in frustration. Okay? So that was George Washington's metaphor. He is saying the system we have now under the Articles, it's a rope of sand. And he's saying we shall be as easily broken. If a foreign country wants to come in and, you know, bully us around, you know, we're done for. Okay. Now let's look at, you know, how and why. Okay, you can kind of look at different numbers to understand the specifics as to why the Articles are, you know, in what way it was weak. 13 states, all of them are required to amend the Articles, okay? You know, so again, in order to change the Articles, you had to get all 13 to agree, okay? I don't know about you or your circle of friends, but anytime I've gone out with people, in fact, when I try to decide on what movie we're going to watch on Amazon Prime, you know, my wife can take like 40 minutes to decide, you know, and we watch a few previews and, you know, this and that and look at the ratings. To try to get 13 states to decide on an amendment, okay, you know, they never actually did, okay? They never actually did, as bad as the Articles were. There was one attempted amendment trying to get Congress the power to tax imported goods, tariffs. And all the states except one, Rhode Island, were in favor of it. And Rhode Island said, no, we're not going to do it. So several states sent delegates to Rhode Island saying, you better not screw this up. We're going to boycott your state. We're going to punish you if you know. So finally, Rhode Island says, okay, you talked me into it. We'll agree with this. And at that point, delegates from Virginia were told that their state legislature withdrew support for the new tariff. And so at that point, everybody threw up their hands and said, you know, we're never going to be able to get this Articles amended. The current U.S. Constitution requires 3/4 of the state legislatures to approve of any amendment. And 3/4 is a good number, okay? You don't want to amend the Constitution every single day. You know, it shouldn't be that easy. You know, on the other hand, if 3/4 of the states feel something is important, we need to change that, then yeah. But if you had all 50 states being required to give approval, I don't know that we have any amendments at this point, okay? So it set an unrealistically high bar for changing, okay? Now you might think, well, why did they do that? Well, one reason I can think of is that they needed all 13 states to buy into the war effort and to join. If one of the 13 states were to give up and tell the British, okay, you can use our ports as free bases for you guys, we're no longer going to fight the war. That would have been horrible for the war effort. So all 13 states needed buy-in. They needed to be guaranteed, hey, join the rebellion, and it's not going to come back to bite you. And the way they could guarantee that was, hey, join our Articles of Confederation, and if there's ever any change that you don't like, just don't approve it. And each of the 13 states gets veto power. So this arrangement could generate buy-in because states didn't have to worry about joining this government of the Articles, and then once they joined, finding, oh no, now they're changing the rules on us. We didn't sign up for this, to use that phrase, they wouldn't have that experience because any changes needed the approval of each of the states. So that is one reason why I'm speculating they might have wanted that. Now, the number one vote per state, equal voting. Each state would send a delegation of anywhere from 2 to 7 members to Congress, and then that delegation would have one vote when it came time, for voting on laws. Okay, so you could have 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, members, on the floor of Congress, and that delegation would have one vote. Now, what type of states do you think would like that? Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah.
The small states?
The small states with only a few people. Because let's just say the small states like Vermont, okay, or New Hampshire, they would have one vote in Congress just like the larger states, okay, Pennsylvania or New York or Virginia, okay? So the reason why small states like that is because this maximized the political power. You could only have a few people in your state, but you would have just as much say as states with several times your population. So the small states loved this. Now, as you can imagine, the big states thought this was a ripoff. The big states, again, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, they're thinking, well, hey, we have lots of people in our states, and yet we don't have any more voting power than these little rinky-dink states that have got like a fourth of our population, So this second thing, one vote per state, equal voting, the small states loved it, but the big states thought they were getting ripped off. Okay, now we have 3 zeros. Okay, 0 power to regulate commerce. Commerce just means trade, when people buy and sell goods from each other. Commerce between the states. In other words, Congress had no authority to tell 2 different states how to accept goods from each other, or there were actually, believe it or not, states that were getting mad at each other. And these states would raise tariffs on goods from other states. And Congress was powerless to do anything about it. Okay? Now, you might think, okay, well, is that big a deal? Why don't just let them have their little argument? Well, imagine this. Just imagine in America today, we are trying to go to the store and get some frozen orange juice. But because California is mad at Florida, okay, California's decided to levy high tariffs on orange juice made from oranges from Florida. So instead of paying, I don't know, maybe a couple bucks for one little can of frozen orange juice, with all the tariffs now it's $5. And then imagine Florida's going to retaliate against California. So Florida would have a $10 per ticket tax on any movie shown in Florida that was made in a Hollywood motion picture company. Okay, do you see how crazy things can get? How expensive everything gets? And nobody really gains anything. It's just that everybody's becoming more miserable. Okay, so Congress was powerless to stop different states from doing that. And then also, Congress was powerless to regulate trade between the U.S. and other nations. Congress had no authority to impose tariffs on any imports. Okay? Now you might think, well, gee, how was Congress able to get money? Well, that's a good question. It didn't have power to get money. Okay? The only thing Congress could do under the Articles was simply give each state a certain amount, like a quota of money. Now, it was based on the value of their real estate. Now, you might think, well, gee, in the 1700s, did any state know how much their real estate was worth? Well, yes, because back then, they collected property taxes. And you would say, okay, my home is worth, $200,000 on Zillow, and the property tax is X amount of money, so, I mean, obviously, back then, whatever. But you would report to the state how much your property was worth, and then you'd have to pay a tax on that. So the states kept meticulous care of how much their taxable property was. So what Congress would do, they would look at each of the 13 states and say, all right, if your taxable property is worth, I'll just pull a number out of the air, $20 million, your tax will be $100,000. If your state over here, if your property is worth $10 million, you will be given a tax of $50,000. Now, all Congress could do is just give that number to the states. You pay us $100,000, you pay us $50,000, you pay us $75,000, and hope that the states would forward the money. Okay? Congress had no IRS, no way to make anybody pay. There was no court system, no federal courts. Each state had their own courts, but there was no, so even if you could arrest somebody for not paying taxes, there's no courts to try them and convict them, So all Congress could do is just give a quota, give a number to the state, and hope that they would forward the money. Sometimes the states would, sometimes they wouldn't, okay? Now, you might think, well, gee, you're fighting a Revolutionary War. Why aren't the states doing their patriotic duty? Why aren't they giving Congress a bunch of money? Well, you got to understand, during the war, each of the 13 states not only provided soldiers for the Continental Army under George Washington, and Washington would use that army anywhere he wanted or anywhere Congress told him, but each state funded their own state militia. Okay, because let's just say George Washington and Congress decide, well, we're not going to put any troops in Maryland. Okay, we think the troops would be better off in New York City. So Washington and Congress evacuate the Continental Army from Maryland. What's Maryland going to do? If the British show up, they want to have something. So each of the states had their own little state militia that they would be trained and armed, and their job was to provide protection for that state. Okay. Well, obviously, you need to, pay these people. You need to make sure they're equipped and supplied with weapons and clothing and whatnot. Okay. And then also, if the British come in to your state, whether the Continental Army is there or not, if they come in and there's a battle, they're going to destroy the crops in the nearby area. Okay. Back then, we had agricultural society. 80% of society were farmers, and the main source of anybody's wealth was crops that grew from the ground. So the British troops would come in, and if you resisted them, they'd burn and destroy your crops. And that means the landowners aren't going to have anything to sell at the end of the harvest, and if the state wants to tax them, they're not going to have any money to pay their taxes with. So again, the idea here is that the states sometimes didn't have a whole lot of money. So I'm not saying the states were bad. I'm just saying they're fighting a war on their own turf, and they had to fund their own state militia. So the states really didn't have a whole lot of money to give to Continental Congress. Okay. Okay. The fourth number, the second zero powered the executive. They technically had somebody who was known as a presiding officer. In the Articles of Confederation, they said, we're going to have a presiding officer, and all that presiding officer would do would be like a secretary who runs a meeting. Okay, if you remember, like your high school, groups, clubs, you'd have a secretary kind of take notes and say, okay, this is our agenda, that we're going to have today. So there was a presiding officer who would, give the agenda for the day or for the week. But there wasn't any president who could veto laws. There wasn't any president who had any authority to sign treaties or anything like that with foreign countries or anything. There was no president, there wasn't an executive. Now you might be thinking, well, Why would they create a government like this? Again, like I already said, keep in mind, they were rebelling against the British and their tyrannical authority, and they didn't want to recreate a tyrannical government in Philadelphia that would do the same things they didn't like the British. So they deliberately kept the Articles of Confederation, they deliberately kept the national government very weak, okay? Now, in another context, let me read you a quote from Andrew Jackson. Because in 1832, he was writing about this time here, okay? Under the Confederation, then, no state could legally annul a decision of Congress or refuse to submit to its execution, but no provision was made to enforce these decisions. Congress made requisitions, like quotas, requests for money, but they were not complied with. The government could not operate on individuals. They had no judiciary, no courts, no means of collecting revenue. Under its operation, we could scarcely be called a nation. We had neither prosperity at home nor consideration abroad. In other words, Andrew Jackson was saying, at home, we didn't have wealth. We were not a prosperous society. Abroad, we didn't have consideration. In other words, nobody was afraid of us. Nobody gave us any respect. We were an incredibly weak government that everybody knew was too weak to stand up for ourselves. So, people didn't care. They could do what they wanted to us, okay? So, again, in terms of why, like I've said, they knew they were designing a weak government, but the reason was they didn't want to recreate a tyrannical government on American shores when we were at the time fighting against Britain's tyrannical government. So that was why it was deliberately weakened. Under the Articles, there were a few crises that alerted everybody, hey, we can't keep going on like this, okay? One of them, I'll briefly run through three. Newburgh Conspiracy. I don't know if you've heard this, but you may have heard the idea that George Washington was offered the crown. Well, never officially, but it was in this context, in 1783, that somebody who was part of the Newburgh Conspiracy wrote a letter to George Washington. Now, Newburgh is a fort in New York, and this is where the military was stationed. Now, because of these problems I've talked to you about, Congress hardly had any money. They didn't have money to pay Washington's soldiers. Now you remember why Washington had to write Congress saying, hey, you need to give me money so I can pay the nurses. Well, Congress didn't have any money, okay? So the soldiers who fought the war, the Revolutionary War in 1783, they were getting nervous because they had a retirement settlement that was promised to them that Congress had no money to give them. And then there was back pay that, their monthly salary. Congress hadn't given them, some of their months they got salary, some they didn't. So Congress owed them their retirement bonus, the settlement, as well as some of their monthly salary, okay? Now, at Newburgh, they're thinking, wait, this is 1783. They were aware that the Treaty of Paris was going to be signed any week now, any month now. So they said, hey, if Congress isn't giving us the money it owes us now, before the peace treaty is signed, once they sign the treaty, Congress will be even less concerned that war with England will break out, okay? So once that treaty is signed, Congress can just send us home and not give us any consideration at all. So some soldiers from Newburgh wrote a letter to Congress in Philadelphia saying, basically, you better not turn your back on the Army. You better give us what, you owe us, okay? Now, one of the leaders wrote a letter to George Washington saying, you know what? The civilians in our society have turned their back on us. The fighting's over, so now they think they don't need us anymore. The guy wrote Washington saying, why don't you take your army, take us? And he wanted Washington to form a new country along the Mississippi River, all this land here. He said, if the people of the United States don't think they need their military, why don't you just take the military and we will live here and we'll form our own new country. And then the soldiers said, and you, George Washington, you can be king, if you want to. So it was never a formal, Continental Congress asked George Washington to be king. No, nothing like that. But one of these angry soldiers said, hey, you want to be king, lead the army, we'll have our own country, and then we will let these civilians here see, what it's like having a country without their army, because they turned their back on us, So it was in that context that he wasn't technically, offered, a crown. Washington replied back to the Newburgh Conspiracy. He wrote them back saying, if you thought I was ever going to join this harebrained scheme of yours, forget it, He said no. He showed up and made them vote to repudiate that letter, okay? So he said, no, nobody's going to be marching on Philadelphia. It's a democracy, okay? And then he said, look, okay, he wrote to Congress saying, guys, I've been writing you this all year, for years and years now. You need to pay the soldiers. You need to give them something. So Congress, of course, with no money, gave them bonds, which were worthless, and just said, here, you guys can have these bonds, promises to pay in the future. Is there a question, Anna?
Yeah. When did we officially came with the United States as the name for the country? I'm just curious about it.
I believe we were called the United States at this time.
Okay.
You know what?
I don't know the year. That's so fun.
I'm going to make a note to myself.
All right.
I'm pretty sure we were called the United States under the Articles, but.
And the American, when I was just saying, what are we really Americans? I don't know, I might be wrong. I think the Spanish named us America, the Americas. I don't know, I'm not sure. I got to research.
The name America came from Amerigo Vespucci, who was an explorer and a map cartographer.
All right.
He wrote a map and he showed America as like a separate group of land, a separate continent, not as part of India or Asia.
All right.
He was like early 1500s, so that's why he is, his name was given to because he said, hey, this isn't just like a big, the first part of Asia that you meet. It's a separate, So the name ultimately can be given, to anybody.
All right.
It kind of irritates people who aren't from the United States that we call ourselves Americans because, we have North, South, Central America. Technically, you could say anybody, North, South, Central America is an American, I like what they do in Portuguese. They have one way of spelling that word to be like an American, U.S., and then they have another way to spell it. It means like a resident of the Americas. So as long as you're reading Portuguese, you're clear who you're talking about.
All right.
I don't mind the name American. I mean, it sure sounds a heck of a lot better than United Station.
So for
that just, So, anyways. Okay, so the Newburgh Conspiracy again illustrates Congress had no money and people were angry, and at least a few soldiers were saying, we ought to march on Philadelphia and make them pay. Okay. There was an Annapolis Convention. Now, this was in Maryland, and in 1786, several states got together, and they said, okay, we know Congress needs money, so let's get some laws proposed, amendments proposed to get a tariff. Well, not every state attended, and that was kind of bad because remember, you need all 13 states to be approval, to approve of an amendment. And then they said, you know what? Under the current system, we're never going to make any changes. So they wrote back Congress in Philadelphia in 1786 when the Annapolis Convention met. They said, you know what? This isn't just a tariff problem. We need to rewrite the rules to our government because, again, asking all 13 states to give approval to every single amendment, including any tariff law, is just not going to work. So they said, have another convention next year. And we're not just going to talk about tariffs. We're going to talk about all the changes we need to make. And that's exactly what happened. Annapolis Convention of 1786 1787 in Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention met, and that was where they discussed and voted on and approved the Constitution that we still, are under. Okay. So again, the Annapolis Convention, now this wasn't like nobody was going to shoot anybody over this, but this was just some of our best minds are thinking, you know what? Under the current rules, we can't even get a lousy tariff passed because we need all 13. So they said, call another convention next year, and this time we're going to just rewrite the rules from the ground up. So then the last, Shays Rebellion. Now this was, Daniel Shays was a farmer in Massachusetts. He was mad at the government, but this wasn't like a real bloody episode. There were like maybe a couple of people died. Nobody in this rebellion wanted to kill anybody, but it was just tempers were flaring. Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War veteran. He and some farmers went back to their farms, and they were, of course, by these states that were low on money. The states raised property taxes. They said, hey, we need property owners to fork over cash. And, some soldiers who would come back to their farms would find everything totally in an uproar. Maybe all the farm animals had died off. Maybe the farm hadn't been, maintained right. Maybe, instead of all, 100 acres, maybe, the mother and, the teenage son had only been able to plow and harvest a plant, maybe 10 or 20 acres or something like that, So it took a long time to get the farm back up to full production, okay? Here's the government, the state government showing up, oh, okay, well, now you better start paying your property taxes. And many farmers were finding that they couldn't afford to pay and that they were being, the state was foreclosing on their property, okay? Now, again, Daniel Shays led a group of farmers who were angry about this process. Again, nobody wanted to kill anybody else, so that's why, there was a lot of anger, but there was only a couple of actual deaths. Shays Rebellion, they would, band together, and when there was like a hearing to foreclose on somebody's property, a few folks would show up with some guns and tell the judge, you don't really want to hold that hearing today, do you? Or if they held the hearing and a marshal was given papers to deliver, saying that we're foreclosing your farm, they would, find the marshal and track him down and saying, okay, why don't you just hand over these documents and, and nobody's going to get hurt, that sort of thing. It was a very forceful non-cooperation, but it wasn't like, people were trying to kill anybody, okay? Now, there was one shooting when they brought in a militia, and they found some of Shays' guys by a weapons cache, where they had some weapons, and a couple of people died, but again, it was, nobody really wanted to kill anybody else, but it just illustrated the weakness of the country, okay? Here, you had the western half of Massachusetts couldn't enforce its laws, couldn't enforce tax payments, and the government was helpless. Okay, now if that sort of thing were to happen nowadays, you'd probably have the National Guard brought in, or maybe U.S. forces. Okay, U.S. national forces. But there was no president. Okay, and there certainly was no standing army. And even if there was no money. So the U.S. government, the national government, was just helpless. They would look on and see, and anyways. Shays Rebellion evoked different reactions, okay? Some people looked at Shays Rebellion and said, you know what? The problem with Shays Rebellion is that we don't have a strong government that can step in and make people obey, that can impose order. So the solution is to create a new government that's got a lot more power, so that you can't have a few people with guns decide they don't want to obey the laws. Okay. Now, other people, like Thomas Jefferson, this was the context. Thomas Jefferson wasn't that worked up over Shays Rebellion. In fact, I probably should. memorize that line that